Today we're going to talk about some unpopular opinions or hot takes about books that I hope don't get me canceled, but you never know these days. Starting off with one that I don't think should be controversial, to be honest, but it probably will ruffle some feathers. If the only books that you rave about are the most popular book talk books, I'm not convinced you've actually discovered a love for reading. I suspect you might be reading for a sense of community. So when I see someone exclusively reading only like the most popular books, Colleen Hoover, Frida McFadden, A Court of Thorn and Roses, Fourth Wing, Quicksilver, A Fate Inked in Blood, One Dark Window, books in that area, I get the sense that that person hasn't really found like their niche of what they most love in a book. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying if you love some of those books and you also read other types of books that are less popular, that that's the case for you. But if you exclusively read like the top 50 most popular books right now, I'm just not sure that you've found what you love in a book yet. And I suspect that probably a lot of the reason why you find yourself drawn to those books has to do with wanting to find a sense of community and bonding with other people over shared hobbies, which there's nothing wrong with. But like 3 years ago, for instance, when I was querying my debut novel, The Curse in Their Veins, I was still like newer at getting back into reading. And so a lot of my comp titles and a lot of my favorite books at the time just reflected that I hadn't really found like the niche that I most love about reading. I was thinking about it more from the perspective of like popular books rather than like what I truly love about books. And it took a few years of experimentation realizing that like I'm actually not even big on fantasy. I actually prefer horror and thrillers, books with speculative elements that are based in the real world. And then I kind of honed it more and more and I realized, oh, I really enjoy gothic horror. I really enjoy historical literary gothic horror. So that's always something that's kind of like in the back of my mind. When somebody is only exclusively reading like super popular books, my hot take is that they're either just dipping their toes in the world of books and or they're reading because they want a sense of community. Moving on to one that is more of a personal preference than a hot take, but I think a lot of you guys will disagree on. I hate it when a book is longer than like 350 pages. I find it to be disrespectful of my time. Don't get me wrong. I totally understand that this is just a personal preference. Other people love to be embedded in like a different world for that long, and I get it. It's just that I personally have commitment issues when it comes to books. That's also why I don't read series, because I'm just like, you want to take up like 60, 70 hours of my life? I don't think so. There's so many books out there that I want to read, and I literally think I'm like addicted to starting books. I get like a physical rush when I open a new book. So maybe it's a personal problem, but like for me, it's like, I want to try all the books, therefore I don't want to start a book that's like 500 pages long. There is an exception to this. If it's one of my like favorite authors like Elizabeth Kostova, Deborah Harkness, who I find write really, really beautifully, then I don't mind being in those worlds for a little bit longer. It's just that it would still be more enjoyable for me if they kind of trimmed it down, because after a certain point, I just get kind of impatient. Another one that's completely just personal and subjective is, for me, the quality of the prose is the most important aspect of a book, and it's what I give the most weight to when I'm rating a book. A book could have fascinating characters, really propelling plot, realistic dialogue, big themes, but if it's not written in a way that I consider to be cleverly crafted, unique, and vivid, it's really going to be a struggle for me to give it any more than like 3.5 stars. And I get the sense that most readers actually read for things like character and plot and dialogue. And I'm not saying they're wrong for that. I'm just saying, like, for me personally, if it's beautifully written, that's all I need. That alone will get it to 5 stars for me. And because I think we all kind of read for different reasons, you know, some people read for dialogue, for character, for themes, blah, blah, blah. Because of that, I think there will never be such a thing as an objective rating, because we give different amounts of weight to the different aspects of the writing. So whenever I see like on Goodreads someone saying subjective rating, objective rating, I'm like, there's no such thing as an objective rating. Let's be real. There's no such thing. You are still probably valuing certain things at a greater weight than others. Now, this next one I actually feel a little bit vulnerable sharing as an author, and it might get me some criticism, but I really don't think it should be controversial. I get a little bit sad sometimes at the fact that really poorly written smut sells so much better than like really well-crafted pieces of literature. Look, I get it. Sex sells. We're animals. Sex is like one of the biggest drive of animals. And this is nothing against smut or erotica as a genre, or you, if you read those genres. I think as far as sexual content goes, erotica is probably the most ethical to consume. Clearly, it serves a function. There's like a big portion of the population that has a desire for those types of products. But I'm somebody who tries to make my work as well written as possible through beta readers, professional editors, taking months apart from my manuscript to kind of come at it with fresh eyes, reading constantly, taking creative writing seminars, learning more about the craft. Like, I do all these things to make my book as close to perfect as possible. And then to see books that are selling so well, that are written at the level of like a fifth grader, and have racist tropes and are all just smut. I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I do wonder, like, why do I even bother? I could just write smut instead and it would sell better. Sometimes it doesn't feel fair, but I guess, life's not fair, so that's just something that I have to come to terms with. Because again, sex sells. It's always going to be that way, so I gotta make my peace with it, I guess. While we're on the topic of smut, this is another one that I think might ruffle a few feathers, particularly within the dark romance subgenre. I think we need to be open to having discussions about the impact of certain subgenres. Every now and then a person comes along and says, hey, I have a concern about the way that this type of artwork is impacting consumers. Whether it be this is romanticizing abuse, or this is showing gratuitous violence against women that serves no purpose, or this shows very graphic violence that is borderline traumatic for the audience. Like, as an example, the movie Irreversible that kind of terrorized viewers. But sometimes people will come forward and they'll say like, hey, I have a concern about like this type of artwork and the impact that it's having. And unfortunately, I see that a lot of those people get immediately shut down with people saying things like, what do you care what people read? Or what do you care what people watch? How does it concern you what type of video games I play? And I think just because someone is engaging in a private hobby in the privacy of their home doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to have discussions about the impact of that hobby. What we do in private doesn't happen in a vacuum. It affects us, and we in turn influence the world around us. Now, I think the issue with this is that a lot of times when people approach this topic, they start to get very derisive. They're very mocking, not only of the artwork, but also the people who enjoy that artwork. And I do get why people get offended about that. I also think sometimes people overgeneralize the problem. Sometimes people will say like, all romance books are corn, instead of saying like, hey, some dark romance books have some pretty concerning implications. Or they'll come out and say, if you watch horror, there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Instead of saying like, hey, some types of gore are super misogynistic against women. Like, sometimes I think people will make these arguments and they come from such an extreme judgmental place that it's like, of course, people are going to get offended over that. But my hot take is that at the end of the day, if someone's being respectful and they're not overgeneralizing the problem, we should be able to have conversations about those things. And we don't get a free pass to just not examine the type of media in question just because we consume it in private. And if you have an argument as to why that person is wrong in being concerned, then you should be able to verbalize it instead of just shutting that person down. Up next, I know there's this whole debate between like books aren't inherently political versus books are always inherently political. My hot take is that I think books can be political, but they don't always have to be. Some are political, and that's okay. Some are not political, and that's okay too. Because I don't think there's really such a thing as an apolitical person, I think the author's political worldview will always shape the artwork that they create. But that doesn't mean that there's always a super political message or focus in that piece of artwork. And okay, this last one is probably the most controversial one. Please don't hate me for what I'm about to say. It's going to be so awful. Generally speaking, with exceptions, I don't enjoy books written by men as much as books written by women. Again, I'm speaking in trends here, and there are absolutely exceptions to this trend, but I've noticed that I can usually tell when a book is written by a man based on the style alone. And that style is often not not what I love in a book. I'm a person who loves purple prose, vivid descriptions, atmospheric writing, attention given to the five senses, very immersive, emotional, tangible writing. And that may have been more common among male writers in like the Victorian era, but in modern times, from what I've observed, it's typically a more feminine way of writing. Like I said, there are plenty of exceptions to this. Plenty of female authors write beige prose. There are plenty of male authors who write purple prose. But of the books that I've sampled in my lifetime thus far, this is the pattern I've noticed. Male writing, in my opinion, is a lot more economical, more bare bones, more threadbare. You know, I think of like the most quintessential male voice as like Ernest Hemingway. The old man did this and the whale did that. The mountains were white in the distance and she sat in front of me. And that doesn't mean that there isn't an audience for it. It just means it might not be for me personally. Those are my hot takes. What are your controversial book opinions? Pop them in the comments down below.